The wind rolled across the dry plains like a tired old song, carrying dust, memory, and regret across miles of empty land. And on that lonely afternoon, a cowboy named Caleb Turner sat outside the Broken Spur Saloon, staring at nothing but the road that stretched toward the horizon, a road he had ridden 1,000 times yet never felt as heavy as it did that day, because the news that rode into town that morning was heavier than any saddle he had ever carried, heavier than any bullet wound, heavier than the silence between heartbeats. Mary Whitfield was getting married tomorrow, and not to him. Folks around Red Hollow knew Caleb Turner as the toughest man west of the Dry Creek Ridge, a rancher who stared down rustlers, fought off outlaws, and once rode 3 days through a blizzard to save a herd of cattle. But what they talked about most was the strange promise he had made when he was just a boy. After burying his father on a cold winter morning, Caleb wiped his tears with a dusty sleeve and said to his mother, "Ain't no use crying in this world." And from that moment forward the town swore they had never seen a tear touch his face again. Mary Whitfield had been the only person who ever came close to breaking that promise. She arrived in Red Hollow 7 years ago with her father, a schoolteacher from back east, bringing books, soft laughter, and a smile that made even the hardest men in town forget their troubles for a moment. Caleb first saw her standing outside the little white church, sunlight resting in her golden hair like it had chosen her for its home. And though he had faced gunfire without blinking, that simple moment made his heart stumble like a colt learning to walk. Their story had begun slow and quiet, like rain after a long drought. Caleb would bring fresh apples from his orchard to the schoolhouse. Mary would read him pages from books he never understood but liked hearing anyway. And on warm evenings they would ride horses across the prairie, talking about dreams that stretched far beyond Red Hollow. She spoke about cities and oceans, while he spoke about land, cattle, and building a life that lasted longer than the dust storms that passed through the valley. For years, folks in town believed they would marry someday. It seemed as natural as sunrise over the prairie. But life in the West was never as simple as stories promised. Trouble arrived one autumn when a railroad company tried to buy the land around Red Hollow, promising progress and money, yet threatening to take ranches by force if men refused. Caleb stood against them with the stubborn pride of a man who believed land meant more than gold, while Mary feared the fight would only bring danger and loss. Arguments between them began small at first, quiet words spoken under fading sunsets. Mary begged Caleb to sell his ranch and start fresh somewhere safe, maybe California or even back east where life was calmer. But Caleb could not imagine leaving the soil his father had bled for. Every fence post, every hill, every stubborn oak tree held memories he refused to abandon. And so the love that once felt as wide as the prairie slowly began to shrink beneath the weight of two different futures. The final break came on a stormy night 3 years earlier. Thunder rolled over Red Hollow as if the sky itself had joined their fight. Mary stood on the porch of her father's house with tears in her eyes, asking Caleb one last time to leave the ranch behind, and Caleb, stubborn and proud, shook his head and said the words that would haunt him forever. "A man who walks away from his land ain't much of a man at all." Mary's face fell like a candle blown out by wind, and she whispered softly, "Then maybe you never loved me enough." By morning she was gone. Her father accepted a teaching position in the neighboring town of Silver Creek, and though Caleb rode out there once to see her, he turned back before reaching the schoolhouse door. Pride was a strange and cruel companion. It kept him strong in fights, yet weak in moments that mattered most. And so the years passed in silence until that morning outside the saloon, when the town barber casually mentioned that Mary Whitfield was returning to Red Hollow, not as the girl Caleb loved, but as the bride of a wealthy cattleman named Thomas Hale. And for the first time in 20 years, the toughest cowboy in the valley felt something inside his chest begin to crack. The morning of the wedding arrived slow and quiet over Red Hollow, the sky glowing pale gold as the sun rose above the dusty hills. Yet for Caleb Turner, the day felt heavier than any storm cloud. He had not slept much the night before. Instead, sitting on the wooden porch of his ranch house with a cup of cold coffee in his hands, staring out across the land that had once been the reason he let Mary Whitfield walk away. The cattle moved lazily through the pasture, the wind brushed through the tall grass, and everything looked exactly the same as it had for years. Yet nothing inside Caleb felt the same anymore. The town of Red Hollow buzzed with excitement that morning. Wagons rattled along the main street. Women carried baskets of flowers toward the church. and men stood outside the general store, talking about the grand wedding between Mary Whitfield and Thomas Hale, a wealthy rancher who owned land stretching nearly 10 miles beyond the valley. Folks said Mary would live a comfortable life now, a life full of security and fine things that a quiet cowboy like Caleb could never offer, and while Caleb pretended not to care, every laugh drifting through town felt like a reminder of something he had once held in his hands and foolishly let slip away. Around mid-morning, Caleb saddled his old horse Ranger, the same horse he had ridden with Mary years ago across the open prairie. The leather saddle creaked softly as he climbed on, and for a long moment he simply sat there outside his ranch house. Staring down the dusty road that led toward town, he told himself he had no reason to go. The wedding had nothing to do with him anymore. Yet some stubborn voice inside his chest kept whispering that if he stayed away, he might regret it for the rest of his life. So with a slow breath, he tugged the reins and began riding toward Red Hollow. As Caleb entered town, the church bells began to ring softly, their echoes drifting through the streets like distant thunder. People turned to watch him ride past. Some nodded politely while others looked away. Everyone in Red Hollow knew the story between Caleb and Mary, though few dared speak about it openly. He tied Ranger to a wooden post near the church, dust clinging to his boots as he stepped down, and for a long moment he stood there staring at the white wooden building where the ceremony would soon begin, his chest tight with memories that refused to stay buried. Inside the small church, the air smelled of fresh flowers and polished wood. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting warm patterns across the rows of benches. Caleb slipped quietly into the back row where few people noticed him. He rested his hat on his knee and stared toward the front, where the altar waited beneath a simple wooden cross. The room filled slowly with townsfolk whispering and smiling. Children fidgeted in their seats, and somewhere near the front he spotted Thomas Hale standing tall in a black suit, shaking hands with guests, looking proud and confident, like a man who believed the world had already chosen his victory. Caleb watched everything in silence, his face as still as stone. Yet inside him memories began rising like ghosts from another lifetime. He remembered Mary laughing while chasing fireflies near the creek, remembered the first time she rode beside him across the valley with her hair dancing in the wind, remembered the quiet evenings when they talked about building a future together. Each memory cut deeper than the last. But Caleb held himself steady, because a promise made long ago still echoed in his mind. Real men didn't cry. Then the church doors opened slowly behind the crowd, and a hush spread through the room like wind passing through tall grass. Caleb looked up just as the music began, soft and gentle, and there she was, Mary Whitfield, stepping through the doorway, in a white dress that seemed to glow in the morning light. Her father walked beside her, holding her arm proudly, and for a moment the entire world seemed to stop moving. Caleb's heart pounded so hard he could hear it in his ears, because the woman walking down that aisle was still the same girl who once rode beside him beneath open skies. As Mary walked closer toward the altar, Caleb felt something inside him tremble for the first time in years. She looked happy, peaceful even. Yet when her eyes briefly scanned the crowd, they paused for just a second when they reached the back row. And in that silent heartbeat, she saw him, Caleb Turner, sitting there with his hat resting in his hands. Their eyes met across the church filled with people, across years of pride, mistakes, and unspoken words. And though neither of them spoke a single sound, Caleb suddenly realized something terrifying. The promise he made long ago about never crying again was beginning to feel weaker with every step she took toward another man. The church had grown so quiet that even the faint creak of wooden benches sounded loud in the still air. Mary Whitfield continued walking down the aisle with slow, graceful steps, her white dress brushing softly against the polished floor, and Caleb Turner sat frozen in the back row, feeling as if every second stretched longer than the last. He had faced stampedes, gunfights, and blizzards without fear, yet nothing in his life had prepared him for the sight of the woman he loved walking toward another man. Each step she took felt like a hammer striking against the walls he had built around his heart for 20 long years. Thomas Hale waited proudly near the altar, his black coat straight and his chin lifted like a man certain of his place in the world. The townsfolk watched with smiles and quiet whispers, believing they were witnessing a beautiful beginning. But Caleb saw something else entirely. He saw the memory of a different life, slipping away with every breath he took. The life where Mary rode beside him across open land, where laughter echoed through warm evenings, where promises were whispered under star-filled skies. and suddenly he realized something painful and simple. The land he once chose over love now felt emptier than the desert beyond Red Hollow. Mary finally reached the front of the church and turned toward the crowd for a moment before facing Thomas Hale. Yet something about her expression had changed. The calm smile she wore seemed softer now, uncertain perhaps, as though part of her heart still wandered somewhere far beyond the church walls. The preacher cleared his throat and opened his worn book, preparing to begin the ceremony, and Caleb felt the weight of time pressing down on him like a storm ready to break across the plains. The preacher's voice echoed gently through the church as he began speaking about love, devotion, and the promise of two lives becoming one. The words drifted through Caleb's ears yet barely reached his mind. Instead, he kept seeing the same memory over and over again. Mary standing on that porch years ago during the storm, asking him to leave the ranch and start a new life with her, and hearing his own stubborn voice refusing. Pride had seemed so strong in that moment, so certain. Yet sitting there now, Caleb understood the truth that pride had cost him the only thing that ever truly mattered. As the ceremony continued, the preacher finally reached the moment everyone had been waiting for. He looked toward Thomas Hale and asked the familiar question about love and commitment. Thomas answered with confident certainty, his voice clear and strong. Then the preacher turned toward Mary Whitfield, sunlight shining through the church windows and resting gently across her face. The entire room seemed to hold its breath as she prepared to answer. But before the words left her lips, Mary glanced once more toward the back of the church, toward the quiet man sitting alone in the last row. Caleb Turner had not moved. His broad shoulders were still, his hat rested in his rough hands, yet something about his face had changed. The walls he had built for decades were finally breaking apart, and when their eyes met again, Mary saw something she had never seen before in all the years she had known him. A single tear slid slowly down Caleb Turner's cheek, cutting a thin path through the dust on his weathered face. It was small, quiet, almost invisible to the rest of the room, but to Mary it felt louder than thunder rolling across the valley, because everyone in Red Hollow knew the story of Caleb's promise, the cowboy who swore he would never cry again after burying his father. Yet here he was, breaking that vow at the very moment she was about to become another man's wife. Mary's breath caught softly in her chest as the tear fell, and for a long silent moment the church seemed to disappear around her. She no longer saw the guests, the flowers, or even Thomas Hale waiting beside her. Instead, she saw the boy who once brought her apples from his orchard, the man who rode beside her beneath endless skies, and the stubborn cowboy who had finally learned too late that some things in life mattered more than pride. And as Caleb quietly lowered his head, believing the moment had already passed forever, he never noticed the faint trembling in Mary's voice as she prepared to speak the most important word of her life.